I want to start today by telling you something I don't think I've ever said quite this plainly on my podcast before, and that is I'm biracial. So, unless you know me, I don't think you would know that, but my heritage is Trinidadian and Italian. And for most of my life, when people have said or used the word black in community spaces, in art spaces, or on funding applications, I didn't fully know where I fit. That word, for me and for so many people from the Caribbean diaspora, it doesn't hold all of who we are. It doesn't hold, for me anyways, the roti and the pasta. It doesn't hold the calypso and the accordion. It doesn't hold the very specific, layered, beautiful, complicated experience of coming from somewhere, not just from a color category. And yet I've spent 10 years building spaces for African and Caribbean diaspora artists, not because I had it all figured out, but because I knew from the inside what it felt like when the room wasn't built for you. So today's episode is all about that. It's about belonging, about what we're building, and why I think the language we use to describe our communities matter more than most institutions are willing to admit. Welcome to Be Inspired, your ultimate resource for finding inspiration. I'm Francesca Durham, independent curator, cultural strategist, and someone who has spent the last decade building creative ecosystems for African and Caribbean diaspora communities in the Halton region. This is a show where we talk about art and identity, community, and the real work of building something that lasts for ourselves and for those who will come after. And I'm so glad you're here. And if you listen to my last episode, Stay the Course, you heard me talk about holding on, about not abandoning your vision when everything feels uncertain, about the discipline of staying present in the work even when you can't see clearly where it's going. This episode is what comes after that. This is what I like to call the blooming part. And speaking of blooming, let me just take a minute and talk about Still Blooming. That was a multidisciplinary cultural exhibition on at the Art Gallery of Burlington up until May 24th of this year. And I can hardly believe it's already been 3 months and I'm still in that strange space of thinking back to what it was like from the 7th of February until May 24th. And now that it's all over, the exhaustion and feeling in my mind anyways, reflecting back on what has happened, what it all meant, and what I'll be building next. And so instead of being quiet, I decided that I want to talk about it, about the experience, because I think what happened in the gallery and what is happening in the broader landscape of African and Caribbean diaspora arts in Halton right now is a conversation that needs to happen out loud. So let's talk about it. I want to start with something that might feel like a small thing, but actually, I believe anyways, it's foundational. And that is the language we use to describe our communities. There is an ongoing conversation, particularly within the Caribbean communities, about the word Black. And I want to add my voice to that conversation carefully and honestly. Black is a powerful word. It has done and continues to do important political and advocacy work. The Toronto Arts Council's Black Arts Projects program, the Black North Initiative, Statistic Canada's data collection, funding frameworks that allocate resources specifically to address anti-Black racism. those systems use Black as their operative category. And I'm not going to make our community invisible in the rooms where those decisions get made. So in those contexts, I use that language because that's where access lives. But in my curatorial practice and in how I describe the arts I work with, or the artists that I'm working with, the communities that I serve, the exhibitions I build, you'll often hear me say and use the language African and Caribbean diaspora. And here's why. It is specific. It names heritage, and geography, and cultural lineage, and it honors the enormous diversity within communities that Black can sometimes flatten into a single, undifferentiated category. So if you think of a Trinidadian artist, an artist from Ghana or Haiti, or even an Afro-Cuban artist, all have deeply different cultural contexts, like languages and histories, relationships to colonialism, relationships to art. Those distinctions matter. They should be honored, not erased. And personally, and I'll be honest with you, as someone who is biracial, the word Black has never been a category that fully held my experience. Not because I'm distancing myself from it. That's the last thing I'd ever want to do. I love my community, but because my identity is more specific, more layered, and more complicated than any single color category can contain. I think a lot of people in our community feel this way. They just haven't always had the language or even the platform to say it. So going forward on this podcast and in my work, you'll hear me use African and Caribbean diaspora as my primary framing, not to abandon any solidarity, but to be more specific, more accurate, and more respectful of the full richness of who we actually are. Both things can be true: solidarity and specificity, community and complexity. And that's where I live. And this year, the Canadian Caribbean Association of Halton chose a theme for their Black History Month art exhibition that I think says it better than I ever could in a policy document or a funding application. And the theme was, out of many cultures, one people. That phrase, rooted in Caribbean heritage, borrowed from Jamaica's own national identity, names exactly what I'm talking about. We are not one thing. We are many things together, many islands, many languages, many histories of migration and mixture and survival and joy. And all of it belongs in the room. And when I saw that theme, I thought, yes, that is the conversation we need to be having, not just in February and not just in a gallery, but in how we fund the arts, how we describe our communities, how we build institutions, and how we tell our stories. I think that we're in a remarkable and complicated moment for African and Caribbean diaspora arts in Canada right now. There is more formal funding allocated toward Black arts infrastructure in this country than at any other previous point in history. The Canada Council had a deadline going back to February for artists and organizations to access grants, and the Toronto Arts Council has dedicated programming. Municipal cultural departments across the GTA are developing equity frameworks. So on paper, the conditions for our communities to thrive, they have never looked better. And yet, the artists that I know and work with are still struggling to access it. The organizations doing the deepest, most sustained community work are still under-resourced. And some of the exhibitions being funded, I'll be gentle but honest, are still more about diversity optics for the institution than they are about the genuine ongoing investment in the practice of the arts involved. So I want to ask the question plainly, is the money landing where it needs to go? And what does it actually take to make sure that it does? Because here's what I've learned from the inside of 10 years producing the community cultural programs and access is not just about whether the money exists. It's about whether the pathways to that money were designed with your community in mind, whether the language in the application makes sense for the way your organization actually works, and whether the timelines accommodate the reality of artists who have day jobs and families and community obligations, and whether the institution assessing your application has any genuine knowledge of your cultural context. That's the access gap that nobody really talks about that I'm highlighting here. I'm talking about it now. So what Still Blooming has taught me, the name Still Blooming was chosen with intention. There are exclamation marks inside the words because the interruptions are part of the statement. That tension is deliberate because the artists we featured are not blooming despite the conditions they navigate. They are blooming through them. And that is a very different thing. And I want to be clear about what the work in that exhibition was and wasn't. It was not about overcoming adversity. I'm tired, deeply tired of African and Caribbean diaspora art being primarily framed through the lens of survival and resilience. Yes, resilience is real. Yes, survival is real. But those are not the whole picture. They are not even the most interesting parts of the picture. The artists in Still Blooming were playing. They were experimenting and grieving and celebrating and questioning and laughing. They were just making things that were beautiful and strange and specific and communal and deeply rooted in their heritage without needing to explain that heritage to anyone, without having to translate themselves for a room full of people who needed to be educated about their existence. That is what happens when you build a space where the community the art is for is centered in the room, not as an afterthought, not as a beneficiary of someone else's programming vision, but as the reason the room exists in the first place. And I learned, producing that exhibition and 8 years of exhibitions before it through the Halton Black History Awareness Society, that the infrastructure work is just as important as the curation, maybe more important. Artist contracts that are equitable, compensation frameworks aligned to Carfax professional standards, not charity rates, production timelines that respect the full reality of artists' lives, communications that doesn't extract more labor from already stretched community organizations. None of that is glamorous. None of that ends up in the press release. But all of it determines whether artists can afford to keep making work, whether they trust you enough to say yes the next time, whether the ecosystem grows or quietly contracts. Out of many cultures, one people. That theme from the Canadian Caribbean Association of Halton's art exhibition lives in all of this, because the infrastructure I'm describing, the contracts, the compensation, the timelines, the trust, that is how you honor the many. And that is how you make the one people feel real. So here's what I think institutions need to understand, and I want to speak directly to them for just a minute. The galleries, the municipalities, corporate sponsors, foundations. I mean, I know some of you are listening, or your teams are, or somebody will share it with you. And I want to speak with generosity, not with grievance here, because I genuinely believe most institutions want to get this right, and they just don't always know what right looks like from the inside. They're getting better, but we're not quite there, not yet. So here's what I want you to know from many conversations from over the years, listening to many artists. Artists want to feel valued, yes, but they also want to be compensated fairly for the value they bring to the table. Programming is not the same as investment. A single exhibition, a February Black History Month slot, a diversity spotlight, that's programming. Investment looks like multi-year partnerships, operational support for organizations doing sustained community work year-round, paid pathways for emerging artists, yes, but all other categories too, please. And lastly, this is the one that I feel most strongly about. Authentic cultural programming requires authentic cultural input at the decision-making level, not just at the delivery level. So if African and Caribbean diaspora creatives are only being brought in to execute a vision that was designed without them, then you're still operating from a model that doesn't fully trust the communities you say you want to serve. I've been in rooms where institutions got this right, where the community shaped the vision, not just the execution. And the difference in the quality of work, in the artist experience, in the community response, in the institutional reputation, it's profound. Going back to out of many cultures, one people, that principle doesn't just belong in a gallery. It belongs in your boardroom. It belongs in your hiring decisions. It belongs in your funding criteria and your programming mandates, as well as your strategic plans. And when institutions genuinely build that in, not as optics, but as structure, everything changes. So I want to be honest with you about where I am personally right now, because this podcast has always been about the real conversation, not a curated one. I'm in a period of genuine realignment. For the last several years, I've been doing this curatorial and cultural production work while simultaneously leading talent acquisition strategy in other sectors, and I've been operating across two professional worlds. And, I think I've been good at both, and I've been very grateful for both. But I've been asking myself a harder question. And it's not, what am I good at? But what do I actually want to build in this next chapter of my life? And the answer that I keep coming back to is this. I want to build the infrastructure that makes it easier for the next generation of African and Caribbean diaspora artists and cultural producers and creatives to do what they do, the frameworks, the funding, the pathways, the institutional relationships, the compensation models, the platforms, so that the work I've been doing for 10 years, often quietly and behind the scenes, becomes something sustainable, visible, and lasting. Still Blooming was just a piece of that. This podcast is a piece of that. And there are some other conversations I've been having recently at a policy level, at an institutional level. I'll share more to keep you updated and posted. And when I do, I think it is going to reframe a lot of what I've said today about what's possible for our communities in the Halton region and across the GTA. So if you've been following my podcast for a while, thank you for staying the course with me. You stayed, and now you're about to see why that mattered. And if you're new here, welcome. You found this at exactly the right moment. Thank you for spending time with me today. This one came from somewhere real, and I hope you felt that. If this episode did resonate with you, then please share it, because these conversations grow when more voices are in them. Send it to an artist who needs to hear that their cultural specificity matters. Send it to an institution that's trying to figure out how to do it better. Tag me when you do. I want to know where this lands. Next time, maybe we can talk about how to navigate the arts funding landscape, specifically for African and Caribbean diaspora artists and organizations who've been told the system is for them, but haven't always found that it feels that way. I have things to say about that too. But for now, keep building, keep blooming, and stay inspired. I'm Francesca Durham, and until next time.